Hello and welcome to MASHmouth, a podcast covering every single episode of the hit 1970s sitcom MASH. I'm Ethan.
And I'm Vanessa.
Vanessa, first of all, we should say apologies for not uploading last week. Fate was not on our side. You were sick, and unfortunately, just the way that we have to record things now, we did not give ourselves a lot of room for backup. So, apologies for coming back from hiatus and immediately missing a week. We feel pretty bad about that.
Yeah, that was pretty terrible. I was sick with COVID last week, actually. And I had started my first real lawyer job as well. So it was just it was a time, that's for sure.
It was a double whammy of unfortunate events, let me tell you.
Yeah. So that was not fun. This is funny because we had tried to record and I was literally in bed, just sinking further and further into my bed sheets as we were trying to record.
Yes, you trying to record in bed with a tray where you put your microphone was perhaps the most precarious podcast setup of all time. It was very funny, and you just like Hawkeye at the end of this episode just looked more and more like a corpse as it went on. It was just very sad to watch.
Yes, it was not a lot of fun, but here we are. We're back again. Hopefully without taking any more breaks due to illness or other life obligations. So,
hopefully.
Hello again.
In theme with us apologizing, we should also mention that last episode we got the title of the episode wrong. You said the wrong thing.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about that for a second. I don't know where in my brain the title "I'll Be Seeing You" came from, when that is 100% not the title. I didn't catch it the first time. You didn't catch it in editing.
Not at all.
I almost posted on our Instagram for the episode the wrong title again. And I was like, I wonder if I said that in the episode. Lo and behold, I did.
It was one of those things where when uploading the episode, I had to Google the title 3 times just to be sure that the IMDb description was correct, because I trust you for all matters involving MASH implicitly. So you being wrong was a real shock to my system, and maybe is partly because you were already feeling a little sick by the time we recorded that episode. I'm going to give you the out there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't think that's the case, but thank you for the out nonetheless.
It's the only way you could get MASH wrong. I trust you regarding MASH with my life.
Hey, even the best get it wrong sometimes. No, I'm just kidding.
Also, last episode was our 100th episode, and we did not acknowledge that at all.
Wow.
This is our 101st episode. Thank you for being here, everybody, and thank you for sticking with us.
Yeah, after all of this time, after all of our shenanigans, thank you so much for everybody who's still listening to us. And with that, why don't we get into today's episode?
Yes. So, in this episode, Deluge, the camp is, you guessed it, deluged with wounded and several other problems as well. Vanessa, what did you think about this episode?
I really liked this episode. This is a unique one, and I am one to always love the more unique setups of an episode. This one has a lot of B-roll of real newsreels split in between the scenes from the camp, and it does a lot for the plot of this episode that is essentially plotless, but it does so much for this episode, and I really, really enjoyed it.
Yes. Calling it a gimmick feels like discrediting it, but I'm going to call it a gimmick anyway because I don't really know what the other term for it would be. But the gimmick of the newsreels in this episode was very good. I thought how they constructed this episode around the newsreels and contrasting between different ideas of what Frank says versus what the newsreel says and vice versa was very interesting. And I like this episode a lot for its editing and use of the newsreels. However, as an episode of MASH, I do feel it is kind of lacking because it is so plotless otherwise. There's not a whole lot going on. There's one moment of conflict surrounding Margaret towards the end of the episode But that's towards the end of the episode, and we'll get into it. But it was like, I kind of wish this episode was about Margaret's issue rather than it being something kind of shoved in at the end with this flashy newsreel editing otherwise. I wish this episode was a little more focused.
Yeah, it was definitely lacking a little bit of focus, but I think that it still really worked and I still really liked it. Because it was it was almost like a quintessential episode of MASH in terms of it being really unique and also saying a lot about the state of the world at the time and what the newsreels were kind of juxtaposing with what was actually going on at the time.
Yeah.
And I really thought that that was just such a core being of what MASH is. So I really enjoyed seeing that.
I definitely agree with you that this is a quintessential kind of MASH vibe episode. Like, this is another one that feels like it could have been a series finale in a different timeline. It kind of has that sense of finality about what it's saying about the war.
Mm-hmm.
I just wish that the content within the camp had a little bit more going on than what we were given. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get that.
With that said, a lot of the newsreel stuff is used as contrast with what was going on at the camp. Do you have any, favorite moments of that while we're getting into this episode? Because it doesn't really have too much of a plot otherwise.
Oh, I do. Of course
Okay.
I do. So I think the first kind of inkling that I knew what the writers were up to with the newsreels was when the newsreel was saying something along the lines of the greatest republic the world has ever seen, talking about America. And then it cut to a scene where one of the wounded soldiers gets all of his stuff stolen, ostensibly by another American soldier. And I was like, ooh, you guys are really going for it here. So I buckled up for this episode right after that.
That was a moment with Margaret talking to this guy who had his stuff stolen. And I'm so used to Margaret kind of being a complainer around Hawkeye that when she started kind of freaking out that this guy's stuff got stolen, her tone, I was just like, is she mad at him for his stuff being stolen? But literally the next line, it made more sense. But I'm so used to Margaret's moments of having an issue being so not important that I assumed she was in the wrong for this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get that. I understand her kind of blowing things out of proportion or blaming people unnecessarily for things that are not necessarily in their control. I definitely get what you mean.
Okay. In regards to the newsreels kind of interacting with the content of the episode and kind of commenting on it in an interesting way, in a scene in the very beginning, it opens with Frank complaining that they're still there, that they thought that the fighting would stop. And BJ and Hawkeye are referring to the Korean War as a war. And Frank says, it's not a war, it's a police action. And then they cut to a newsreel that says, when will the Korean War end? And it was just the TV show itself saying, shut up, Frank, you don't know what you're talking about. And it was very funny in a kind of subtle way. I enjoyed that part a lot.
Yeah, I liked that too. It was the show undercutting Frank of saying, hey, Frank, yeah, this might be a police action, but it's a war. Shut the hell up, my guy.
Yeah. Very classic montage theory in this episode of creating a new idea by showing two different ideas together.
Mm-hmm.
You could show this in a film class and have high school students write what each cut to the newsreels means in terms of the story of it, and it's very classical, and I really liked it a lot.
Kind of like what we're doing right now with this podcast.
Sure. And there's some great moments. I loved later on they show a newsreel of people dancing, and then it cuts to, with the same ballroom music going on, them taking tally of all the wounded they have, and how it's the medical professionals in the MASH unit are kind of doing a dance, and it's not a dance that they want to participate in, but it's still their version of dancing in a ballroom. It was just like really clever use of music and editing for that sequence.
That's so interesting that you picked up on that, of like showing this dance and then also showing the doctors kind of doing their own version of like quote unquote dancing. That's so interesting because I took it also as showing, and the newsreels did this a lot, but particularly in the dancing scene was very apparent, of showing how life is kind of just going on as normal. And then these doctors and nurses and soldiers are making this ultimate sacrifice of, you know, losing their lives or just having to do anything but the norm of America in the 1950s at the time. Of they're not getting to do ballroom dancing competitions and stuff like that. So it was really, really well done of showing this juxtaposition between normal life and how everything can just go on as normal, like sight unseen, and then how across the world there can be something just terrible going on, that a war could be going on and people are just kind of going about their daily lives.
Yeah, especially as the episode goes on, the newsreel footage kind of gets more and more lighthearted and kind of puff piece. Like there's a whole segment about a cat that can play table tennis, and then it like cuts back to the OR and everything's like exploding and going horribly. It's like, wow, over here we're having a delightful, fun time and like, go boys, go, fight the war. And meanwhile, over there in a police action, these medical professionals have to endure like horrible circumstances and people are dying. Like, it's very nail on the head, like very clear what it's saying, but it says it in a really like interesting way where it's on the nose, but it's still like, ooh, I like how you said that so directly.
Yeah, and the cat playing table tennis, it was like, I think it was that scene with the cat, which the cat was really cute, by the way. Like that's good news, I think. Like I would like to see that now. But also then right after that at the MASH unit, they were saying how they had run out of gloves. The hospital had run out of gloves for the doctors to wear during surgery. So they had to like go in with their bare hands to do surgery. It was such like a, that was a very much like nail on the head, on the nose type of scene. But also what I really liked about this episode, and what I like about MASH in general, is that it almost like flew under the radar, right? Because you can kind of turn your brain off. And if you're not looking for these critical things, you could watch this as like, oh, this is like a cool newsreel type of unique episode. If you're not looking for these juxtapositions, this commentary on war and society and stuff like that, you can overlook it. And that's why I think that MASH does such a great job of being that like social commentary, because you can ignore it if you choose to, but if you know what the writer's intentions are, it becomes very apparent.
Yeah, no, I agree. Especially with this episode, so much of the commentary just comes from the contrast of like the newsreel and the content, where it's not really like Hawkeye freaking out about anything. They are in like a deluge. They're going through it, but everybody's just kind of working and not really like commenting on it in a big way. So it is definitely something that you could ignore if you're only looking at the characters. And I know that I said I wished the content inside the MASH unit was a little stronger, but that is a strong point in favor of this episode, that they are relatively disconnected, but they have a message when put together.
Yeah, absolutely.
One final thing for me that stuck out with the newsreels and the episode content was that early on there's a bit where a man is like giving a speech being like, give blood, be a good American, give blood. And then it cuts to BJ getting like blood squirted into his eye while operating. And that was one of the most viscerally upsetting images I've ever seen on this show so far. Like, that made me uncomfortable. The idea of blood going into my face, I'm like, no thank you.
Yeah.
That is not something that I like at all.
Yeah, that was a really good scene because it was like, oh, okay, this is what you're giving blood for. Oh, yeah, that was quite disturbing and very, I don't know, like realistic. It looked really very much like blood, and it was quite disturbing.
Yeah, I hope that they took whatever precautions were necessary. Because even spraying fake blood into Mike Farrell's face, I'm like, don't do that. Don't get that into his eye, man.
Yeah.
Anything that comes in contact with eyes freaks me out. And the idea of blood getting into my eye, I'm like, no bueno, no bueno. Please, never again.
Yeah, absolutely not. One other scene that really stuck out to me was this ticker tape parade for MacArthur.
Mm-hmm. MacArthur, the real villain of MASH.
Literally. So this MacArthur scene came right after this Deluge scene of getting a lot of wounded and just the chaos of the MASH unit in general. And then to have it contrasted with this MacArthur scene of MacArthur just, being as big as the president, really, and just having this like really ostentatious parade for his homecoming. Meanwhile, he is literally the person who's lining these men up to take on the slaughter. And I really loved them kind of almost showing the hypocrisy there of these top generals, these bureaucratic figures. They'll always make it home, right? They're always going to be safe. They're not the ones who are doing the fighting. They're not the ones who are actually driving the war effort. They're making moves behind the scenes. They get to go home, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought that was just really well done and really poignant to have MacArthur himself saying, we are indeed home. And I really liked that. And I also was reading up on this particular event of MacArthur having this homecoming parade for himself when he was fired by Truman. So thank you, Monster Mash Wiki, for giving me this talking point as well, because this was also seen by a lot of fans as a critique of the Vietnam War by the writers as well, showing this really warm homecoming to MacArthur. Meanwhile, soldiers who were fighting in the Vietnam War were historically not welcomed home in the same way. So I thought that was just a really well done piece of the episode.
Especially with the context of the Vietnam War, how it's saying that, these guys get a parade, but not everybody does. Like, in MASH, Hawkeye doesn't get a parade. He's putting all this work, and he's just going to have to wake up tomorrow and do it all again. Like, you're not thanked for this work, maybe not especially, but I feel like medical professionals in a war setting are pretty underrepresented as an important factor in a military operation where they're not soldiers, they're not on the front lines, but they are putting in highly important work. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and we've discussed that before too on previous episodes where like the doctors are the unsung heroes basically of every war, but especially when MASH units were still a thing of having to just do this type of meatball surgery, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that was really interesting context. And I thought that this episode also had really interesting context for Vietnam as well, because they actually showed a newsreel, and I don't know how accurate it was to the timeline. I know that fighting in the Vietnam War did kind of begin in the 50s. I don't know if it began while we were still fighting in Korea, but they did show images of soldiers fighting in Vietnam and fighting against the terrible red communists and stuff like that. So I thought that it was really interesting that the writers kind of took it there about the Vietnam War, because this show was in general a critique of the Vietnam War. So I just kind of like really liked to see it, and I liked to see like kind of where we were in history at that time too.
MASH, it is the best history textbook that television could offer. We always learn something new about history if you really look for it in the show. Yeah. And including Vietnam, like, directly is very interesting. Like you said, with, like, how you can ignore the commentary, but it's there if you want it. Like, if you're paying attention to the content of the newsreels, it is very important that this is set in the context of the Vietnam War, but if you're not exactly paying attention to your TV at the time, watching a sitcom, you could just be like, whatever, it's more black and white footage, and it kind of breezes past you.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into the tail end of the episode where a little bit more structured plot happens, do you have any scenes that really stood out to you that maybe didn't have necessarily to do with the newsreels, or did? Either one.
I thought this was a great Father Mulcahy episode.
So did I!
He has one scene where he's talking to a wounded guy who's like implied to be a teenager. And he's like, let me tell you, Father, I promise to God that if he let me survive this, I would become a priest. And now I'm having second thoughts about being a priest. And Father Mulcahy being the best TV priest, I think, in the game. I don't know how many other TV priests there are, but he's got to be the best. Is like, don't worry about it, man. If everybody kept their promises to God, there would be a lot more priests in the world. Don't even sweat. And it's just like, great. I love that bit. That makes me love Father Mulcahy. He's such a good, kind-hearted man that I just wish that everyone was. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I know for a fact that we've talked about our love for Father Mulcahy before, and how he's just like a really good religious figure. And I think I finally was able to kind of put my finger on why I like his character, and I like his like use of religion and stuff. Obviously, sometimes it's for comedic effect. But I think that what really gets me about Father Mulcahy and his use of religion is, of course, he's a priest, but he doesn't use religion to guilt people or shame people. And he understands that someone might make a promise to God, right? In an impossible situation, like, you know, being in a near-death situation, in a war zone. And he is not using that admission of that person to then be like, well, you shouldn't make promises to God that you can't keep and all that kind of stuff, even if some people believe that that is the case. But Father Mulcahy is understanding in that way, that these people are faced with impossible situations, and sometimes things happen and are said. And he, of course, takes it super seriously because this is his whole life. He's a priest, but he doesn't use it to make people feel bad. And I think that that is just so good and unique in the depiction of him as a religious clergy person.
Yes, because so often in different media, and I don't even want to talk about real life, I just mainly want to talk about TV shows, that if there's a religious character, they will use their religion to look down on others. Like, it's just a very common trope that people indulge in, and Father Mulcahy is different because he legitimately uses his faith to guide others to the best, like, solution for them. And I love it. I think he's great. I think he's such a fun guy. There's even a scene later on in the episode where he jokes around with Hawkeye and BJ that, like, oh, in order to go through clergy school, he, like, worked as a B-girl somewhere. It's like, that is such a fun thing for him to say, of, like, him being very secure in who he is, and being like, oh yeah, I did this once, and it's, you know, very outside of the religious context. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, I can't sing Father Mulcahy's praise enough. As we know, he is one of the best characters, and I think that he just really focuses on the humanity of religion and brings a reality-focused approach to religion that, you know, you don't see a lot depicted in media, and I think that that is... It's in real life, of course, but you just don't see it a lot in shows that have priests or other religious figures. So I appreciate the writing of Father Mulcahy. What can I say?
Absolutely. I think it's just that in comedy, it's easier to have somebody be, like, mean than they are to be, like, a good person. So that's why you see, like, the bad priest a lot more than you see a good one. But moving on from the topic of religion, do you have any scenes that you want to discuss?
I do. So there is this one insane scene where where the doctors remove phosphorus from a guy's leg,
dude,
and it glows and you can see it, and it's so interesting, and I was like, whoa, I can't believe that this is real. Like, I was sitting there wondering, I wonder if this is real. But then I remembered that Walter Dischel, the medical consultant on MASH, took painstaking steps to make sure that things in this show were medically at least plausible. So I was like, this has got to be real. I'm not even going to look it up. I know that this must be real because Walter Dischel is not going to steer us wrong.
No, I love this scene as well, and it felt very much like a tangent to educate the audience on the medical practices of like a MASH unit and perhaps other places. That's like, hey, did you know that they use phosphorus to identify different foreign objects in a body? Isn't that cool? You know, like it felt like that, where it's like, hey, check out this cool medical thing that we learned and we want to share with you.
Yeah, it was really interesting. It was a really well done scene. It was pretty cool to see them like pluck the glowing things out of this guy's legs. So yeah, I really liked that scene out of context of like the rest of the episode and the commentary and stuff like that. I just thought it was really cool.
I like that scene a lot too. As someone who watches a lot of like informational stuff, that just hit the center of my brain where I'm like, ooh, I'm learning something.
The last scene out of context of the rest of the episode was Hawkeye leaving a sponge in a patient. And I had to say that Frank was giving Hawkeye a lot of crap for this. And honestly, I had to give it to Frank on this one.
Kinda deserved.
Yeah, it's like honestly totally deserved because he truly would have been put through the ringer if that was Frank. Hawkeye would have never let him let it go. In fact, I feel like there must have been scenes in previous episodes where Frank messed up like this, and Hawkeye definitely didn't let it go.
Frank is usually so sloppy. They even comment on it later in the episode. So the one moment where Hawkeye's been sloppy this entire show, like Frank must be on cloud 9 because he finally gets to say like, oh, you're not as good as you think you are, even though Hawkeye is as good as he thinks he is. It's just that they're being deluged and, you know, circumstances are very extraneous. Meanwhile, Frank messes up in like every day when they're not being deluged. But hey, you gotta take a win where you can get it. And I do not like support Frank in his berating of Hawkeye, but I understand why he felt the need to berate Hawkeye as heavily as he did, because he's been dealing with it for a while now. So you gotta throw it out sometimes, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely begrudgingly had to take Frank's side here, that he deserved to get his hits in. So now we're in more of the tail end of the episode, and there's this one scene that has stuck out to me since I was a child watching MASH, when Margaret barges into Colonel Potter's shower and is like, "Sir, how dare you want to send the nurses out?" And I loved this scene so much.
I assumed you would. This is a very Vanessa scene.
It is.
I was waiting for your opinion on this.
So for context, earlier in the episode, it was supposed to have marked when China had entered into the war and kind of gotten involved, and that there was, again, a deluge of soldiers and wounded in battle and fighting and whatnot, and enemy soldiers were kind of fast approaching where the MASH unit was and like the American line and stuff like that. So Colonel Potter was thinking about going to send the nurses out of the camp for their own safety and whatnot. And we've definitely seen that tossed around. In fact, it did happen at one point where the nurses all had to evacuate back in the earlier seasons. And I just thought that this scene really gave a lot of context to who Margaret was as a character. Like, she's not one to abandon her post and her responsibilities because she just really cares about the work she's doing, and that's not new to her, but I like to see this kind of like fleshed out a little bit more, not me just being like, no, Margaret just really cares about the work, don't worry, but it's like actually being shown on screen now. And I liked that even though Colonel Potter is just trying to keep the nurses safe because there could be a lot of issues for women if there's an invasion or stuff like that, Margaret knows that she's just able to handle it and she's going to be able to keep the nurses safe. And she's like, don't worry, just leave it to me. Like, I can do this. And I just really loved that Colonel Potter then turned around and trusted her. And he didn't just kind of take his gut approach. He was like, all right, if Margaret says she can do this, then she can do this. If she says the women are going to be safe, then the women are going to be safe. And I really loved that.
This is a moment that I've been waiting for a while, because a lot of the times when we talk about Margaret, you're always insisting that they will eventually develop her character in a more interesting way, where they give her a stronger backstory and like family ties to the military that really inform who she is. And I feel like, even though this is not the first time we've heard about her military father and everything like that, this is one of the first times it takes it like dead on seriously, where it's not a joke at all. It's like Margaret is a military brat to the end. Like, this is her life. She needs to be here. She wanted a crew cut as a child. And that's like not a joke even. Like, it's funny to hear, but it's like not a wow, Margaret's ridiculous joke. It's like this is how invested in the military she is, that she didn't understand what a civilian was as a child. I thought this scene was really interesting and added a lot to the episode that wasn't there outside of the newsreel editing contrast. I wish that this was saved for a different episode, so this could have been the entire like plot. I wish there was more about Margaret and her like struggle with this, and like Colonel Potter changing his mind and everything. I thought that could have been great, but I think what is here, the two scenes that involve this, well, 2.5 really. There's a scene where Hawkeye and BJ like discuss it, but it's like kind of offhanded. But in terms of this plot, there's more that could have been done, but I think what's here is really good. I just wish there was more. You know what I mean?
Oh, of course, because I am always want for more Margaret backstory and more Margaret character building. So I'm glad that you really liked this scene. And I agree that I wish that this had been more of a focal point of either this episode or maybe another episode. But I did really enjoy what was here. I also really liked the contrast with the newsreels after this scene as well, to bring it back to that for just a second, because a lot of the times in discussions about war, especially in Korea and Vietnam and stuff like that, we forget that women were also part of the war. And it's largely because most of the war effort was fought by young men and stuff like that. But women were also struggling and were also signing up and also experiencing this like terrible carnage and whatnot as nurses at this point. And then in this scene where Margaret is saying, let us stay even though it's dangerous, we can do it, I can do this, I can take care of the nurses, you know, this is really important to me. Having this scene with Rita Hayworth afterwards saying, I think she said something like really just silly. I forget exactly what she said, and it's not like an indictment on Rita Hayworth or anything like that, but she said something very like mundane or just like very average experience in American life. And I liked that this scene was kind of saying, hey, listen, it's not just the men who were struggling, the women also were struggling in this war too. Like, they also have an experience here. And there were women at home who were just doing mundane, normal things. And Rita Hayworth was saying, you know, like cutesy little things in an interview.
Go get them, girls. You know,
yeah,
stuff like that.
Stuff like that. And women were also experiencing this terrible war experience. So I just really liked that they included this with Margaret's character.
I feel like this is a turning point for her. I don't know if it will be. I don't know the progression of Margaret's character in terms of how it fully plays out, but this feels like one of the first times that they really sat down in a regular episode that wasn't really focused on her and like took her seriously as a character and took like the women a little more seriously. And you're right, I don't know exactly what Rita Hayworth said specifically, but it was very like nonchalant, kind of a nonsense little platitude. So I didn't even think about that contrast. That's a contrast I didn't notice. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, of course, of course. Just you wait with Margaret. We're getting there with her.
Mm-hmm. This is a tangent. It's literally just a thing that I want to say to you.
Go ahead.
I have never seen anything with Rita Hayworth in it. I've only seen her referenced. She's like important to the Shawshank Redemption. She's in a newsreel in this, and I'm like, I have no idea who this lady is. Like, I don't know what film she's been in. I don't know what kind of career she's had. I just know she's iconic for like one thing, and that's it.
I have not seen a lot of old movies like from that time period, but I do know that she was iconic in the 1950s time period. She was Hollywood's darling.
Yeah, she was a go-to like sexy girl, and that's like all she's known for these days.
Yeah, which is like kind of shitty, but also yeah, like I think that she was in a lot of movies, but she was definitely like a Marilyn Monroe like sexy type of symbol.
But even Marilyn Monroe, I could name a Marilyn Monroe movie, you know, like the 7-Year Itch and everything.
I can't. I don't think I know a single Marilyn Monroe movie. Say her most popular one, because I would really love to know.
Some Like It Hot is probably her like most famous. That's a great movie. I've seen that one. That you should watch that. It's really funny.
I didn't even know she was in that. I have heard that movie before, but I am not a unless it's Al Pacino, I haven't watched a lot of old movies, as you know.
Some Like It Hot is like an icon of queer cinema before that was like even a thing.
Oh my god, Some Like It Hot. Isn't that the one where it's like the guys and they're cross-dressing and stuff like that? Yes. I forgot that she was in that. That's so interesting.
So, continuing to talk about the end of the episode, things kind of escalate in the OR and the camp in general. They're running out of blood. Radar is trying to get blood by talking on the phone and like looking through his like broken glasses, and that whole bit was very funny. All the different things that he like offered in exchange for blood I thought were very interesting. Like he at one point was like, yo, we got a lot of toilet paper. Do you need toilet paper? And I thought that would go a lot further because I thought toilet paper would be like the gold of a military base. But whatever. Anyway, after Radar kind of talks a guy into giving him blood through the exchange of like dirty magazines, in the OR, this was kind of scary. There was an explosion. Like everything was coming to a head. And then it cuts to more dancing. And I thought this was a very interesting way to end the episode before the final scene. What did you think about all this?
Yeah, I really liked this. It was a lot of like building chaos because it was literally like a when it rains it pours type of situation because it was raining and the roof was leaking and they had no gloves. The laundry caught on fire. There was a light bulb that blew out and then there was this big explosion. And then the fade in of the music and the dancing came back. And I loved that. Again, it was such a good piece of commentary of this terrible stuff is happening across the world and people are just kind of going about their daily lives as if people aren't regular Americans who were kind of just like plucked from the draft, aren't experiencing the most crazy, insane stuff. That normal people couldn't comprehend unless they were actually like sitting in it and doing it as well. It was a really good way to end the episode.
Yes, the chaos of this was very real. Like we mentioned earlier with the BJ getting blood squirted into his eye. Like everything that went wrong in this episode felt way more like visceral than it tends to be. Like it felt legitimately dangerous and like exhausting. This episode was directed by William Jurgensen, who also directed the Aid Station episode, which had a very similar kind of exhausting on the front vibe. So I think it's interesting that he, outside of being the regular cinematographer for this show, has directed the more intense episodes. I think that's an interesting niche to have.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and he did a phenomenal job with both. In general, it was just really good, and then that final scene just kind of really hit home.
Yeah.
Because right after this OR scene, too, there was a scene of the 4077 being awarded this Meritus Commendation. And I just I also really loved this as a fine point on the episode of them being awarded this medal or whatever it was for doing really great work. And it almost felt like a slap in the face, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, you should be grateful because we gave you this medal. And it's just like, you know what we would be grateful for? Ending the war. Please
home.
Don't make us do this anymore. As if it's like this big gift that they should be so thankful for when they're doing this like impossible stuff. So I loved it. I loved this being the final touch to this more commentary forward episode.
Shout out to Alan Alda's performance in this final scene, because he has no lines. He's just lying down on a bed, and he looks like a 3-day-old corpse. He looks like he has not slept in weeks. I don't know how they managed to accomplish this level of exhaustion in his wordless performance, but my God, like, give him an Emmy just for the look on his face in this final scene.
Yeah, it was great. And then Mike Farrell too, like the two of them together in that one scene where they're just so tired and just done. It was just really well done, lineless acting, just facial expressions only, just so good.
It looked like a Renaissance painting. It was an image.
It was.
And so there is one final scene where Colonel Potter walks into the women's showers and compliments Margaret for standing her ground and not leaving. And that was a very nice way to end the episode.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, just real quick, on that?
That was part of the thing that I remember most from this episode as a kid. There are certain scenes from certain episodes that just have stuck with me for all these years. And Margaret walking in on Colonel Potter first, and then Colonel Potter walking in on her back. Those two scenes just have stuck in my head for so long. And it was really cool because thinking about it now also, they did it in the shower, and it might have been like an innocuous type of thing just to like, you know, put a little bit more comedy in the episode, right? But
there are probably better places to congratulate Margaret, let's be real.
Yes, but it was interesting because they were, like I said, they were both in the shower, and Margaret was coming to Colonel Potter at this vulnerable time when he was in like this vulnerable state. And so I liked what they were kind of like doing there. It might be reading a little bit into it, but I think that just having them be in the shower, like being able to be like quote unquote vulnerable in front of the other was really, really good on the writer's part.
Yeah, because the tone, especially with the final scene where Colonel Potter comes in to Margaret, there's no like sexual nature of it. There's no like, what are you doing? Get out of here. It is like pure respect. And I quite liked it that they did that parallel without like doing anything weird with Margaret in the shower. There's no joke about it. It is purely professional. Again, probably a better time to come in, but hey, you know, we got to do what we got to do for our cinematic parallels.
Of course,
I thought it was a great way to end the episode as well.
Yeah. So that's the end of the episode. So Ethan, did you have any favorite lines from this episode?
I don't have a lot of super comedic lines, but one line really stuck out to me in that phosphorescent tub scene that we talked about, where Klinger is talking to Hawkeye about like, oh, how do you remember all of this? And Hawkeye eventually says, oh, it's easier to be a doctor if you think you're God. And it's just like, wow, ooh, that hits hard, man. That's like a good line. That's like a novel line right there. I don't know.
Yeah.
Ooh.
That was a really good one. Mine was a little bit more comedic, but also kind of just like comedic in a very sad way.
Okay.
It's in that final OR scene, I'm pretty sure, where everything is just kind of going wrong. And Hawkeye says, Colonel, I don't know how to tell you this, but I've had a better offer. Right. And then Colonel Potter says, take me with you.
Yeah. Another Colonel Potter line that's really good is, I'm not over here because I'm such a big fan of diarrhea. That's classic grandpa speak, in my opinion.
Classic Colonel Potter. Classic. My final line that I had noted down was, something that we had talked about before when Frank said, it's not a war, it's a police action. And BJ says in response, if it's a police action, why didn't they send cops?
That's a great line. That's a simple one-liner, but I love it.
Yeah, that was a good one.
So, Vanessa, do you have any trivia for us in this episode?
I do. Okay, so I have a bit of trivia on the MacArthur ticker tape parade that we saw featured in one of the newsreels.
I'm excited to hear about it.
So I don't have much trivia on it, but for a little backstory, the term ticker tape parade originated in New York City after a spontaneous celebration on October 28th, 1886, during the dedication of the Statue of Liberty.
Oh, spontaneous. That's really interesting. That's like the original flash mob, I guess.
That's such a funny way to put it. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. The ticker tape parade that was given to MacArthur for his homecoming after he was fired by Truman that occurred in 1951 was one of the longest and biggest ticker tape parades, with 3,249 tons of paper used as MacArthur's motorcade went 19 miles along the New York City streets.
And I just feel bad for the people who had to sweep that up.
Oof, yeah. I do feel bad for the sanitation workers in NYC. I also have trivia on the Harvest Moon Ball, which was also featured in the newsreels of this episode.
A lot of real-life events that we're covering today. I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, so the Harvest Moon Ball was an amateur ballroom dance contest held in New York City every year between 1935 to the mid-1980s. The ball held divisions in several popular ballroom and folk dance forms, but it was mostly famous for showing artistry from several iconic generations of Harlem Lindy pop and jazz dancers.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder why it stopped. That sounds like a institution at this point, you know?
Yeah, it took place every year in Madison Square Garden, and I couldn't really find too much information about it, but I did find that the Harvest Moon Ball provided a place for Black American visionaries such as Herbert Whitey White and Louise Mama Lou Parks and others to showcase Black American and Harlem, New York culture. And I did find a few websites and videos about the Harvest Moon Ball. So if anyone is interested and wants to do a little bit of a deeper dive, you will have some sources to go to.
I may do that deeper dive because that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it was really cool. I did watch some of the videos on a YouTube channel that I found that I will be linking in the description. It's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a lot of fun. I wish that these events were more like common these days. I feel like we don't have a lot of like fun culture events that aren't, you know, the Met Gala or whatever, you know, like the really high-end stuff. I want stuff like this to come back.
I feel like it exists. You just probably don't hear about it as much because it's all like things like the Met Gala and stuff. But I'm sure if we went looking for it, especially in New York City, I bet we would find it.
Yeah, I bet too.
So I also have some trivia about the guest stars in this episode. So Cario Salem, I will do trivia on him in a later episode because he shows up in a more prominent role later on in the series. But I do have trivia on Anthony Palmer, who played the sergeant, who was literally in the episode for about 2 seconds. He was waiting for his buddy, and then Hawkeye threw him out of the operating room, essentially.
Mm-hmm. I think it's one of the only times that Hawkeye's ever pulled rank on this show.
Yeah. So I couldn't find too much about Palmer, but he played a small role in The Panic in Needle Park, which was Al Pacino's first leading role in a film.
Oh, classic. We love Al Pacino trivia. Very on brand for Vanessa, if you don't know. She's on a quest to watch all the Al Pacino films.
I am, and I will report back when I have watched every single one.
Okay,
so,
looking forward to it.
To continue on with this theme, Palmer also was in an episode of the TV show Serpico, which, funny enough, Al Pacino played the role of Serpico in the movie Serpico.
Now, I have not seen the Serpico TV show, but I have seen the Serpico movie. And let me tell you, that does not really lend itself to a TV show. But I guess you could say the same thing about the original MASH movie. So
true.
Maybe it's a hidden gem. I don't know.
I mean, it was only on for, I think, 1 season, so maybe not. But, you know, who knows? Maybe it was gone before its time to shine really came.
There's a lot of shows like that, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. So, other than that, Palmer was in an episode of The Twilight Zone. He played Richard Nixon in the TV movie J. Edgar Hoover in 1987, and his last credited role was in the 1995 movie Where Evil Lies.
Okay.
We like to sometimes showcase a little history here, a little, guest star action. So, even though I couldn't find too much, I do like to, I like to research these people's careers.
It was a small but big variety of trivia this week, and thank you for bringing it to us.
Of course, I had so much fun researching it. Okay, Ethan, so what was your martini rating for this episode?
This is a great episode. I think is a 4.5 out of 5. It is carried by the newsreel montage gimmick, but it is a very effective use of that gimmick. I do wish that the content in the MASH unit was a little stronger, as I said before, but I think everything comes together really well all the same.
So, this is a rare occasion where I am going higher than you. This was honestly a really perfect episode for me. I really loved this episode. This is a 5 out of 5 for me. It just tickled my brain in the right way. Okay. It didn't have like a super comedic effect in this episode. There wasn't a lot of laugh out loud lines and stuff like that. But it was just really, really well done. And honestly, I don't know. I can't really ask for anything better. I do hear you on the less like structured plot type of criticism there. But I don't know. I just love this one.
I fully respect that. And honestly, I'm tempted to change to a 5 out of 5 because I think our discussion of this episode maybe appreciated so much more as it often does. But I do 100% see where you're coming from. This is a very interesting episode of MASH, and one that I can definitely see myself revisiting in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I actually will probably go back and watch this one when we're done recording. Who knows?
Awesome. Let's do a second podcast about it.
Why not? Why not? Follow-up thoughts.
Technically our third with your sick recording, but whatever. So, just to wrap up, we'd like to thank you, Jacob, for your back up for being our technical consultant, Melissa, Vanessa's sister, for our awesome cover art, and, of course, our listeners. Links to our music, social media, and contact for the show are in the description, as always, and join us next week for Season 4, Episode 25, The Interview. But until then, play ping-pong with your cat. Goodbye, farewell, and amen.
Goodbye, everyone.